talking about great books on this show, and we're going to talk about another great book today. Recently released book telling the stories of some unknown Olympians and some unknown Olympic stories. The book is called Hero Redefined, Profiles of Olympic Athletes Under the Radar. And it goes into detail about several Olympic athletes in the history of the Olympics you might not have heard of. Maybe you have, maybe you don't know the full story of them. And it goes into detail, telling some great stories, overcoming adversity, overcoming things like racism, injuries, many challenges, and even going into some very interesting details about recovery of some Olympic facilities, and a fascinating story about how one man essentially got one Olympics in a place that nobody thought could ever host the Olympics. It's a fascinating book with some fascinating stories, and I'm so excited to be joined by the author today to learn more about his process in writing the book and the book itself. Pleasure to welcome Doug Levy to the show. Doug, welcome to Off the Podium.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben. I'm excited to talk with you and your listeners.
I'm excited to talk to you as well because, as I just said to you off air, I finished reading this last night. A fantastic book. And I got to say that even as an Olympic geek myself, Doug, the majority of these people I hadn't heard of. There were a couple I had, and obviously one in particular that we'll talk to who's quite a name in this country. But I'd love to just get the process of what led you to writing this book. You obviously got a background in sports reporting as a journalist, but this is your first book, Doug. So sort of what made you want to write this book?
It is my first book, and I have to tell you, there were two athletes in the book who sort of formed the early nucleus, and one of them is a Swiss marathoner, and her name is Gabrielle Anderson-Schiess, and she ran in the very first Olympic women's marathon. So that was in 1984 at the Los Angeles Games. And obviously today in 2025, we think to ourselves, oh my gosh, there's always been women's marathons in the Olympics. At that time, there were not. That was in Los Angeles, which has a well-deserved reputation for being hot and smoggy and sticky. That particular day of the women's marathon, it was also unusually humid in Los Angeles. And that very first women's marathon had a grand total of 5 water stations for the women entered in the race. And so today, if we run a 10K, we can expect to see 4, 5, 6 water stations over, a 10K course. But in that very first women's marathon, they were pretty sparse. Gabrielle missed the last water station for reasons she can't even detail. And so chapter 2 of the book gets into the massive dehydration and exhaustion that she went through. And I don't want to spoil it for potential readers, but it was quite a journey she went through to finish that marathon and get to the finish line. And I vividly remember seeing the footage of Gabrielle and reading about her, and that formed the idea in my mind. And then in 2012, I read about a United States relay runner named Manteo Mitchell, who was leading off a 4x400 relay semifinal in London in the 2012 games. He is cranking away for 200 meters, and halfway through his leg, he hears a very loud pop. And so he's got to figure out what to do in that nanosecond in time. And I remember reading a little snippet in the paper about that guy and thinking, holy cow, this is crazy. So after a long career and going into semi-retirement, I knew I wanted to write my first book. I remembered those two athletes, and I wanted to research other examples of athletes who I felt didn't necessarily ever get to a medal stand, but did things that were heroic in some way, whether they had a will to get to a finish line, whether they overcame tremendous injury or psychological setbacks, whether they faced racism, as you indicated in your intro, a couple of them who I found out about just exemplary acts of sportsmanship. And that then formed the basis for the book. And then I also was just fascinated by a couple of venues, one in the United States and one in Sarajevo, and what was done to both recruit one of those venues and retain and preserve and restore one of those venues. So, that became the basis for a 13-chapter book with a little 14th chapter on a roll of athletes.
And you grew up as an Olympic fan. I see in your bio that you're a self-obsessed Olympic geek with everything. So, I mean, obviously the Olympics is something that you have always followed throughout your life.
Oh, absolutely. I'm an unabashed lover of the Olympics, and I love it because it's not too often that we gather people from around the world for good reasons. And the Olympics is just that. And when it's done right, it's a worldwide spectacle, and it's noble because the athletes are there representing their country, and in almost all the cases, not really seeing this as an opportunity to cash in so much as an opportunity to be proud of where they come from and do their absolute best. So I've always loved that concept. In the introduction of the book, I quote a well-known basketball coach in our country named George Raveling, who said it's the only time you get to represent your country and not have to carry a gun. And I've always loved that quote. And that to me is what the Olympics at its best is all about.
So you kind of go into a little bit, I love your notes at the end where you sort of, you go over and almost like a bibliography type thing. Here are some links, here are some clarifications there. But I do like how then in the acknowledgements you explain the process of kind of reaching out to these people and obviously a bunch of emails. So once you decided to sort of go through with this, was it that simple case of you're just looking up internet people, finding them online, contacting Olympic committees? Like the process to get these people, Doug, I can imagine was a very interesting one.
It was a journey, Ben, I tell you, because I very early decided on that I didn't just want this to be about American athletes. The Olympics belongs to the world, not to the United States. And so I really wanted to gather athletes from around the world, and there are athletes from 6 continents in this book. But yeah, to your point, I tried contacting Olympic committees, or I would try specific sports federations. There's a sailor from Canada, so I reached out to Sail Canada, which is their governing body for their sailing teams. And I looked on the internet. I used LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook. And sometimes I was successful, sometimes I wasn't. I will share with your listeners, there was a New Zealand runner named Nikki Hamlin who I felt did something extraordinary in the recent Rio Summer Games, and never was able to track down Nikki, and wished I would have been able to talk to her. But that was one of the challenging parts of the book. But looking back, also a really fun part of the book to finally find many of the athletes that I did.
You have one in the section where you talk about, you mentioned obviously the New Zealand runner, but other ones that you tried to get that you couldn't get a hold of. And one who's very near and dear to our hearts in Australia, who we've been trying for 10 years to get on and we can never find him, is Eric the Eel, Eric Musambani, of course, from Equatorial Guinea. So I'm glad you sort of, did you get anywhere with that? Because he seems to be a hard guy to track down.
I, at one time, did get an email from him saying, here's how to contact me. And I reached back out, and then I never heard from him. But I loved with 4 exclamation points his story and what he did and what he became. But never could quite get there on the Zoom screen for an interview. And there was also an Irish gymnast who I was just blown away by, and was able to get a hold of their gymnastics federation. They said, "Oh, we'd love to talk to you," and we just never did connect. So, there were a handful of, say 8 to 10 athletes that fit into that category that in a perfect world I would have added to the book.
Everybody loves a sequel though, Doug. So just saying, they might get back to you sort of in the lead up to that. But I mean, sort of the people that you reach out to and who get back to you, and obviously your profile on the book, some were they more open to it than others? Were there any that you kind of had to really twist their arm? Because you touched on someone like Gabrielle there, and you sort of in that section of the book allude to that Swiss people are very kind of, reserved, and they don't often like to, talk about their achievements. But then you've got obviously the Tanzanian athlete that you speak to, John, who seems like he just wanted to make you move there. Like you literally flew to Tanzania, which I'll touch on separately, but obviously different reactions to the people that you do end up profiling in the book.
Well, this is one strain that ran throughout the book, Ben, and I will have never-ending gratitude for all these athletes, because I will say that every one of them agreed to open up to me and to be candid and tell their story and, allow me to contact their family members and their inner circle. And they didn't have to do that. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I'm a first-time author. So this isn't like your John Grisham or James Patterson reaching out to these folks. This is Doug Levy. They never heard of him. And yet, when I explained to them the premise of the book and what I wanted to do and how I wanted to tell their stories, every one of them agreed to do it. And every one of them was gracious and I thought open in telling their story. Even a few of them who, were talking about events that for a long time they wanted to forget.
Tell me about John, because you got to go to Tanzania for this, and I love this chapter and just everything about it, and his story too, a story that I wasn't familiar with. But this must have been like a great adventure that you can add a trip to Tanzania as part of writing this book.
It was. So you're referring to John Stephen Akwari, and he was a marathoner for Tanzania in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. And the story of finding John is probably the funnest story of any of the athletes because I got absolutely nowhere with all the official channels. The Tanzanian government, the Olympic Committee over there. And so after 7 or 8 of those tries through the more formal channels, I got a hold of our tour company. It's a company called Go to Africa that we were already working with for a trip to Tanzania. And I said, geez, I know this is a needle in a haystack, but do you have anybody on staff or that you work with who's heard of this guy? And they came back a couple of weeks ago and said, well, you're not going to believe it, but we've contacted Mr. Akwari's daughter, Josephine, who lives in Dar es Salaam. And through Josephine, we eventually figured out a place that was close enough to our itinerary to meet up with John. He still had to take a car and a motorcycle, both to and from our interview, which was about, let's say about 90 to 100 kilometers away.
Wow.
But we made it work, and he was one of the most interesting characters in the book and someone I won't be forgetting anytime soon.
Another prominent chapter in the book, and I'm glad you the way you described it and did it, because he's an interesting figure in this country, as you obviously go on to about it, is Peter Norman, of course, famously part of the Black Salute Pride picture that, the other guys he's often referred to. And I love just the detail of telling that story about how he's always been somewhat of a divisive figure in this country, but I like to say that he was just treated like absolute crap. And, obviously, I think that's the gist of it. But, that process of speaking to his family and everything along those lines, because that is a story I feel that a lot of people maybe outside of Australia aren't overly familiar with.
Yeah, I love the Peter Norman story. Obviously, I wish we would have had Peter before us to help tell it. Of course, he passed away of a heart attack back in 2006. But an example of a guy who went out of his way to just conduct himself with an unbelievable level of decency at a time where, race relations around the world were raging and not anywhere near the point they are today, where let's face facts. Today in 2025, I think the United States and Australia and the whole world still has a lot of work to do with race relations. In 1968, when Peter Norman was running the 200 in Mexico City and came across Tommy Smith and John Carlos, as I said in the book, we were only 4 years removed from situations in the United States where Black people didn't even get to sip from the same drinking fountain as white people, or sit at the same counter in a restaurant, or sit in the same section of a bus. And so when you consider the times, it's mind-boggling to think, that Peter, with his Salvation Army upbringing, just cut through all that nonsense and just said, these are people who are just like me. And I'm going to stand with them and help them. And, we all have some of these key moments in our lives where we're at a crossroads. When he faced that key moment in his life, I think he stepped up in a big way.
Yeah. And it's the detail that you obviously mentioned, and it's it's almost like that, very journalistic in the fact that you're telling two sides of the story. So you're obviously telling it from the perspective of, you speak to Strath Gordon from the Australian Olympic Committee, sort of going on about, this is what happened, this is that, but then you obviously go into detail about little things about how he was sort of shunned during the Sydney Olympics, and there was never really that credit that was sort of due. And I think it has always been on that level of, it is a bit of shame, I think, a lot of people in Australia that's how he was treated. And, particularly if that was to happen today in 2025, he would be celebrated. So it's sort of, it still is a story to me, Doug, as well, that I look back on and well beyond my time. But I'm like, how can someone be shunned for doing something so noble?
Yeah. Well, to me, it's the two sides of a coin, though, when I think about Australia. I do think over time, leading Australians became a little ashamed of the fact that they neglected Peter and overlooked the importance of what he did. But here's the great thing about countries that are leaders in this world. Sometimes the best thing you can do is admit to the mistakes and own up to the mistakes and try and rectify them. Mm-hmm. And I think to Australia's credit, they had a resolution in Parliament recognizing Peter and apologizing for the fact that he had been so overlooked. They named, they had a day named after Peter, and they unveiled a statue, right in the hub of where a lot of your stadiums and sporting activities occur, as an homage to Peter. And so I give Australia credit for recognizing that this is a gentleman who, was long overdue for credit. And instead of saying, well, it's in the past, we can't do anything about it, they reached back and tried to remedy some of the oversights. And that's a good thing.
We did that recently here with the Moscow 1980 Olympic team. They had a big day in Parliament, and our Prime Minister formally acknowledged them and thanked them because obviously they were quite shunned going off into those boycotted games. So better late than never, Doug, I guess, down under, right? Like we get there eventually.
That's right.
We're a little bit too laid back sometimes for our own good. I'm like, oh yeah, we'll do that one day. And then, it happens. Speaking of unique individuals, though, the last chapter on Alexander Cushing, who basically is a man who got an Olympic Games to a place that nobody ever thought could have an Olympic Games in Squaw Valley in 1960. I was loosely familiar with this being sort of an obscure place to get the Olympics, but I was not familiar with reading about Alex and his amazing story. I mean, this was incredible. I need to go into more Squaw Valley history all of a sudden now, Doug, because this blew my mind.
So this was chapter 13 of the book, and for folks listening, again, you have to go back to the times and recognize how dramatically different they were. So this is back in the mid-1950s, and at that time, the Winter Olympics was really the domain of the countries in and around the Alps. There had been one exception with Lake Placid, New York, but other than that, these countries around the Alps just considered the Winter Olympics to be their games. So it's a very different situation than what we think about today with the Winter Games having been spread over a lot of places on the planet. At that time, there was a very myopic view of where the Winter Olympics belonged. Then along comes this transplanted New York attorney named Alex Cushing, who sees these hundreds of inches of snow a year in the Sierra Nevadas and becomes enthralled, by this place called Squaw Valley that, as you allude to, no one had ever really heard of it in the mid-1950s. There were a couple of other ski resorts nearby, but it wasn't like it is today where it's an acknowledged destination point in the United States. And I think the willpower of Alex and the belief in what he was selling, and frankly, the ability to tell a story and ask people to envision something that wasn't necessarily on the ground at that particular time. There really weren't Winter Olympics facilities, but Alex Cushing, God bless him, got the U.S. Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee and all of these evaluators of sites to understand what could be. And with the help of the Walt Disney Company, they pulled off one of the most successful Winter Olympics ever. And, quick footnote for your listeners, Walt Disney, 1960 had been the only Olympics they ever helped to coordinate and choreograph. They're making a comeback. They're going to be doing the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles.
Former CEO, right? He's doing the ceremonies of that, which, we talked about that recently about being the Disney Games. But yes, you're right. Obviously, having a Disney Games. And it's also like, I love the way you go into the detail about it because, people think of California. They think of sun, they think of surf. They don't often think of snow. So I think it's one of these, unique footnotes in American Olympic history that there's been a Winter Olympics in California. That I'm sure there are still Americans to this day who don't even realize that happened in history.
That's right. Well, and especially in countries like yours, you ask someone on the street about California, they'll say, well, Hollywood and sunglasses and women in bathing suits and harmonies by the Beach Boys. And that's the view of California and Los Angeles and Hollywood in particular. But we do that a lot. I think we do it in all of our countries around the world. We have a stereotype. And then, if you dig beneath, people don't know in most cases that there's this place called upstate New York, which has a lot of natural beauty, and the state isn't just what New York City looks like, right?
100%.
And certainly with Australia, if you get beyond Sydney and Melbourne, you discover there's amazing, awesome places to see. Mm-hmm. So I think we're guilty of that all the time, but certainly that made Alex Cushing's job a little bit harder, was to sell people around the world on the fact that California was much, much more than the sunshine and the Beach Boys.
One man he definitely sold, and I love the fact that you referred to, his before and after comments, is a certain Avery Brundage who, we always like to see him get a bit of egg in his face on this show. So that was great to kind of see him get a bit of a, light bulb moment at the end of those games. And, okay, I was wrong. Maybe you can have the Winter Olympics.
That's right. Yeah. And he came back and in his own way admitted it and really complimented those who put on the 1960 games. And of course, if you read the book, you find that Alex Cushing, for as instrumental he was in getting the games there, was not very involved in planning or putting on the games, something he was pretty bitter about. But that's all part of the story and the lore that makes it interesting reading, I think.
Putting my Canadian hat on, given that we are a co-Canadian Australian show, you have two great stories on two Canadian athletes in Lawrence Lemoffin's sailing. Of course, famously in the Seoul Olympics, went back to recover an athlete in the harbour. And then one that I wasn't overly familiar with was Brian Stemmel, who had an esteemed career, had a pretty horrific accident outside of the Olympics, but basically bounced back and was moments away from a famous medal at the Nagano Olympics before obviously not getting it. I love that story. I'm not familiar with Brian at all. So, I mean, you're achieving your goals here, Doug. You're getting people like me to learn about these great athletes and great stories.
Yeah, I hadn't known about Brian Stemmel, and I found out about him in my research. And then he exceeded my expectations, frankly, when we did the interview. And then I enjoyed his sister, Karen, another Olympic skier, as much or more than Brian, because as you just talked about, Brian was a four-time Olympian for Canada, a tremendous downhill skier, tremendous in the air, and one of these athletes you just were sure was going to medal. Never did, as it turned out. But Brian also suffered a near-death injury up at Mount Hahnenkamm in Austria, which, the skiing community sort of considers that the Super Bowl of mountains to ski down. Very treacherous and difficult. And one of the things that struck me during the writing of this and the interviewing and still today is that, the injury Brian suffered, I think, would have kept 99.9% of us from ever stepping foot on a mountain again. And Brian's own sister, Karen, who had preceded him as an Olympic skier, made it very clear that her decision would have been to stop right then and there. I mean, Brian was given a 50% chance to live after this fall he had on Hahnenkamm. And so for Brian to face the music and get back up and decide to get into competitive skiing again, and then to kind of have the wherewithal to understand that his mind needed restraightening, and he worked with a very well-known sports psychologist named Dr. Dana Sinclair. That story just blew me away. And Brian, as it turns out, is a humble, unassuming father of twin girls, and very proud of what he did, and recognizes that he never got the elusive medal, but it's okay.
So one of those moments where you come to terms with it, I think, sort of as you go into that chapter of it. This might be a tricky question to ask you, Doug, because I kind of almost feel each one of these chapters and athletes is almost like a child. You don't want to choose your favorite, right? But I'll phrase this in a way that, what was your favorite in terms of getting from one point to another? That maybe this was a story that you had loosely known a little bit about, but then when you heard the full story, it completely blew your mind and went a different direction than you were actually thinking it would go.
There were a bunch of them, but you asked about the two Canadian athletes profiled in the book. The other who I just loved was Lawrence Lemieux, who sailed for Canada in the 1988 games in Seoul. And what I loved about his story is that he, like many of the other athletes in the book, does not consider himself heroic in any way, shape, or form. Mm. And yet, if you read about Lawrence Lemieux, this is a guy who came from the province of Alberta, not exactly a sailing haven.
No.
Just competed his butt off, and worked like crazy to better himself as a sailor, and got in an Econoline van and drove all over North America. He wanted success so badly, he crisscrossed a continent multiple times. And in 1988, he's on the verge of what he's been spending his whole life trying to attain. He is on his way to either a first or second place finish that probably was going to set him up for medaling in the 1988 Olympics. And then he sees a head bobbing in the water. And so, here comes the little dueling voices in your head, right? Do I keep sailing, keep competing, doing what I love, and, reaching the success I've always wanted to reach? Or do I do the thing I think I better do, which is deal with that head bobbing in the water because it looks pretty bad? Mm. And Lawrence Lemieux left the course, reached a Singaporean sailor named Joseph Chen, and pulled him out of the water. And, you can have lots of debates over whether Joseph Chen would have lived without the help of Lawrence Lemieux. One of the guys he trained with will tell you that guy was in a lot of trouble. And Joseph Chen himself, years later, when he made a commercial with Lawrence Lemieux, certainly treated Lawrence like a guy who had saved his life and allowed him to live decades more on this earth. So, I think you described it very well. It is like asking a parent to choose between, his or her children. I love all these athletes to death. But Lawrence was the first athlete who got back to me, and, profiling his story was just an extraordinary journey, because he did, I think, an extraordinary thing. And I will tell you one more thing, Ben. You haven't asked about this yet, but the other common thread with all these athletes is not one of them considers themselves a hero. Mm. And to me, one of the essence of heroism is the person who does something heroic and doesn't want to go shouting from the top of a roof that they did it. They just do it because they think it's the right thing to do. They're selfless, or they're helpful, or they're giving of themselves. And that, to me, is what makes all these athletes even more fun to profile, and I hope makes the book even more interesting to read.
And also important to have their stories told, right? So that people are aware of what they did, and whether or not, as you're saying, they view themselves as heroes or not, like their heroic acts and everything they've done. These are stories that deserve to be shared with the world.
Absolutely. And the thing I get into in the introduction of the book, and that I want to just dwell on here for a moment, if we take the Olympics, it's not wrong to fixate on the medal winners. Of course, they're doing amazing things. And of course, a gymnast like Simone Biles or a sprinter like Peter Norman, who did win a medal.
Yeah.
They're doing unbelievable things, right? You look at some of the swimmers from your country and you can't help but love them. They busted their butts to get to where they are, and they deserve all the adulation you give them. But I think what I try to have people understand, or at least reflect on in the book, is that heroism, in the case of these Olympic athletes, goes well beyond a medal stand. And then I try and have people understand that there's a parallel in everyday life, especially when we're in times of crisis. Even in Australia, I suspect you got a lot of coverage of the wildfires that struck the Los Angeles area and were horrific in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's firefighters on the front lines battling those. And of course, those men and women are doing heroic things to stave off the flames. But then you read about the woman who establishes the pop-up shop so that people can get blankets and shoes and necessities that don't exist anymore because their homes have been burned down. And that woman who did it, the zero financial incentive, zero celebrity or cash-in opportunities here. She's not going to be famous or wealthy for doing it. She did it because it was the right thing to do and the important thing to do. And we do that all the time as humans. I think there's an element of goodness that especially shows itself in trying times. And that's what I'm trying to get people to understand a little bit in the book, is that both in the Olympics and in life, if you peel back a few layers from the headliners, you'll find some pretty dramatic stories.
And they're great stories, and very educational, entertaining, all those words with that one. I touched on before about the fact that you've got scope for a sequel here with the ones that you obviously couldn't find. I mean, I feel like this is probably like when I do ask an Olympian, oh, are you thinking of the next Olympics straight after an Olympics? They're usually just like, shut up, just let me recover from these Olympics. So I'm sure you're a bit that way right now. I just wrote this book, Ben. Let's just let it rest. But I mean, given the scope of how many more athletes there are out there, Doug, I can imagine that there is, down the line when you're ready, potential for a follow-up here, because obviously you couldn't get in touch with those ones, and there's a whole bunch more out there that you could probably track down as well.
Yeah, I think, and the underlining there is I've been asked a lot, this is your first book, are you going to do a second one? And I've thought about that a lot, and the answer I've come to is that I will. Whether it's Olympic athletes or it's one of a dozen other ideas running around in my brain is yet to be determined, because I've had people bring me a few other ideas, and I've thought of a number myself, and I'm certainly a huge sports fan, but there's also a lot of other things societally that interest me. So I don't know if it'll be Hero Redefined, the sequel, or some other topic, but hopefully in a few years, your listeners will be hearing more from me.
Can I give you two suggestions for two Australian athletes if you want to do a sequel to Hero?
Of course.
Okay, one you're going to laugh at, but I will back that up with facts. But the first one, Australian freestyle skier by the name of Dale Begg-Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not. He's kind of in this area where I know, like as you say, you've got a couple of medalists in this book, but it's not necessarily about the medalists. Now, Dale Begg-Smith is our equal greatest ever Winter Olympian. He's a gold and a silver medalist. But what makes him so unique and amazing, and to this day, I guarantee you could ask 9 out of 10 Australians to name him and they wouldn't be able to remember him or know who he is. He was a champion Canadian mogul skier who was the best in the world. But on the side, he ran a business. He was an internet marketer back in the days when he made millions of dollars off sending spam emails to people. He was that annoying guy, you'd open up your spam box and basically, go away. But he made millions off that. The Canadian Olympic Committee were basically like, yeah, you can't do that. You have to choose either skiing or that because that goes against our principles. So Dale Begg-Smith was like, well, screw you. I'm going to go ski for someone else. So he came and skied for Australia, won a gold medal, won a silver medal. But the beauty about Dale Begg-Smith is the enigma of him, that he's this very reserved, aloof guy who hates attention. He basically gives monosyllabic answers. and he basically apparently lives on a Caribbean island where essentially before an Olympics, he would get a phone call from the Australian Olympic Committee a couple of months out and go, yeah, I guess I can go again. I'll go compete in a couple of World Cups, get the points, go off, compete, come back. He's just an absolute enigma to this day that I don't think anybody's heard from in 11 years. But also, he's apparently the nicest guy who helped shape freestyle skiing in this country. You speak to any mogul skier in this country, they have nothing but praise for what he's done for it. And obviously, we won another gold in Beijing. So maybe, I don't know if that's a bit of a blurred area in terms of the thing with Hero, but he's just an enigma that not only more people in Australia need to know about, I think more people outside of Australia need to know about. But the other one, and you're going to laugh at this, but just bear with me here. I think Ray Gunn deserves a chapter because I think we had her on this show a couple of times before everything that went down in Paris happened, but to hear everything that she went through to get to that spot and then everybody kind of skewed how she got there and all the rumors about how it was sort of, rigged out there. I think Ray Gunn's story needs to be properly told in a book like this to shut a few people up and to really kind of, stop these horrible rumors and give her a chance to, fully tell everything a little bit more so maybe people could listen. So take them if you like, Doug. They're free. You can use them if you want in the future.
I love both ideas there. And that's, to me, that's the fun of books is there's no limit to what's out there and what you can read. And I'm a lifelong learner, so every book is an opportunity to learn something new. And in this case, a podcast interview is a chance for me to learn something new. So that's great.
We're glad to get you on there. And I just want to mention too, I love on your website, you've got here a pretty ringing endorsement from a pretty amazing human being. Sebastian Coe, if you don't mind, has given you a nice little review there. You do profile of his teammates in the book, but must be pretty cool to all of a sudden have Sebastian Coe on the cover and the blurb there saying that he endorses your book.
Yeah, as an Olympics geek, as you said, one of my favorite Olympic sports was and is and probably always will be track and field. And I went to the University of Oregon in the United States, which has just a gorgeous track facility called Hayward Field. It's where our Olympic trials are typically held. But to have Sebastian Coe offer words of praise about the book, and then to have one of our former marathon gold medalists, Frank Shorter, offer words of praise about the book. Yeah, that's a kick in the pants. And Frank Shorter, I got to meet and talk with, and he is the last person on this earth who saw the great Steve Prefontaine alive and kicking. So he was amazing to talk to. Sebastian Coe, I got that quote through David Moorcroft, who's the subject of chapter 3 of the book. So I haven't had the privilege of talking with Mr. Coe, but my gosh, what an icon for track and field for sure.
You were very close to being able to add on that quote, International Olympic Committee president. That would have maybe
he wanted to be. That's right.
It was right. Close, right? Like that wouldn't have been too bad. If people want to check the book out, Doug, I mean, your website authorDougLevy.com. There's details there, but Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. People just head to those websites. Best place for people to check it out.
Yeah, I think especially for the good folks in Australia, whether you like Amazon or not, Amazon's got the book up. Barnes & Noble, as you said, pretty accessible. And a site I really like called goodreads.com. And then if you do go to authorDougLevy.com, you can find out all kinds of things about me and the book. And you can find out about, media interviews I've had. And I also write a blog post every month, which I really enjoy doing.
It's great. It's really, I enjoyed sort of.
And one of them is about, when I wrote the book and the timing of when it was published, Peter Norman had run the fastest 200 meters ever for Australia. That's not the case anymore.
Just recently been broken, hasn't it? Yeah.
About, your teenage sensation who's knocking on Usain Bolt's door.
Yeah,
right?
We love him.
So another interesting guy to profile, I bet.
Oh, Gauk's incredible. And it's sort of in a country where it's so fascinating to me as an Australian to relive Peter Norman's story, to think there was a time where we could win medals in sprinting events at the Olympics. I grew up in a time where we don't even make semi-finals in sprinting events, let alone, win medals. So to see what Gauk is doing and just the excitement around track and field in Australia. We had a pretty successful Paris in that field, and we're obviously so swimming focused that to kind of get back to the real traditional sport of track and field, it's great. So gout. Yeah, adding third extra Aussie alongside Dale and Rachel for Hero Redefined too. Yeah.
We have a phrase in the United States called punching above your weight, and Australia does that pretty consistently in the Olympics. But, if I could, the other thing I would love to just share with you and your listeners is, the other fun thing for me writing about these Olympic athletes is we forget as we dwell on the medalists that the Olympics in so many ways are a crapshoot. Right? I mean, they come along every 4 years, and it may be the perfect time for an athlete, but it may well be the god-awful worst time for an athlete. So if you read the book and you read about David Moorcroft, the British distance runner in chapter 3, David was for many years the very equal of Sebastian Coe and Steve Ovett and Steve Cram. And it had the Olympics been held in 1982 when he stepped on a track in Oslo and obliterated the 5,000 meter world record, we'd be talking about him in a very different way. But because we have this once every 4 years dynamic, there's some athletes who, whether they're snake bitten or it's not their time or their country pulls the rug out with a boycott, they never get to that medal stand. And, I've said this in some of my speaking events, but, let's take you as a podcaster. If somebody said, hey, Ben, I am going to judge you on how good your podcasts were between August 8th and August 29th, 2016. I know you've been doing this for a number of years.
That wasn't a good period anyway, so you're right, yeah.
Yeah, but that's how I'm going to judge you.
Yeah.
That's what we do with Olympic athletes, folks. We sum up their value in our minds in so many ways by what they do in a 2-3 week period. And we forget that there's so much competition, so many performances, so much greatness that occurs outside the Olympics. And it's just another way I want to prod people to think about the Olympics in a little more holistic way.
No, it's a great point, and it's something that we always like to try and celebrate on this show too. Is those stories, and some of these athletes, as you say, they can be the greatest in the world at what they do, but they just, for some reason, there's a 2 week period in a 4 year cycle that they haven't been able to show that greatness. But it doesn't take away from everything else, obviously, that they've achieved in their amazing careers. Doug, you've had an amazing career, and this is an amazing book. And I highly recommend that people get it. As I said, it's available online where books are sold. Good books are sold. Bad book. This isn't a bad book, so it's not going to be on one of those websites. But Hero Redefined, Profiles of Olympic Athletes Under the Radar, available now. Doug, really appreciate your time on the show today. Thank you for joining me.
Ben, thanks so much. I had a ball.